Hello, everybody. My name is Graham Brookie, and I'm the director and the managing editor of the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. It is my pleasure to welcome you virtually to our conversation 2020 Election Integrity and Foreign Interference. This event is part of the Atlantic Council's Election 2020 series, which features conversations on the most critical issues at the intersection of domestic and international affairs that will influence this year's election. And it's really appropriate that we're using the term influence because we're talking about influence operations today. This is a bipartisan series spotlighting foreign policy and national security and drawing attention to often overlooked topics in the run-up to the election. Now, the topic that we're talking about today, foreign interference, is not overlooked at all. In fact, it's one of the primary things that we're talking about as a kitchen table issue with regard to national security in this election. This event is hosted by the group that we work with here at the Atlantic Council, the DFRLab. And the DFRLab exists to basically understand the intersection of government, media, and technology and ensure accountability and transparency online and around the world. The team promotes objective fact. We're looking at disinformation. We're looking at online harms. And we've been a leader in the community committed to building digital resilience against the unique but sometimes related vulnerabilities of disinformation and foreign interference, especially around elections. Today, we're launching the Foreign Interference Attribution Tracker, or FIAT, an open source database that captures allegations of foreign interference in US elections. This is really critical because there are no independent attribution standards for the amount of allegations and attributions of foreign interference. And so when you see something that says there's a foreign adversary that is spreading online influence operations or influence operations or disinformation in the news, the sources of that are sometimes really credible and transparent and sometimes really not at all. And so this is a way to basically cut through all of the things that you see out there and get to the bottom of whether something is happening or not, whether it's credible or not. So after a presentation of this tool, we'll be joined by Politico's Natasha Bertrand and David Sanger of the New York Times, two of the top reporters and journalists that are working on this issue and have worked on this issue that have shaped our understanding of foreign interference and intelligence issues over the last few years. And they'll talk about their experience in covering foreign interference ahead of this election. Before we get to the tracker, I'd like to say one extremely important thank you, and that's a big thank you to Craig Newmark, founder of both Craigslist and Craig Newmark Philanthropies, who has worked to uplift journalism in the face of disinformation and connect efforts to counter destabilizing foreign interference. He has been a major supporter of not only the DFRLab's Foreign Interference Attribution Tracker, but also a bunch of efforts around the community committed to fighting for facts. And so with that said, I thank you for joining us. I thank Craig for his support and want to turn over to him for a few brief thoughts.
Folks, thanks. You know, in 1970, Marshall McLuhan said something that I actually understood. He said that World War III is a guerrilla information war fought equally by military and civilian participants. Our foreign adversaries have declared war on Western democracies, both sides of the Atlantic, and it's imperative that people of good conscience work together, civilian or military, to defend our countries and to defend our democracies. The Digital Forensics Research Lab of the Atlantic Council is a big part of that. It's really important to find out just who is doing the attacking, and the Foreign Interference Attribution Tracker, FIAT, will help people do that, will help the people defending our countries figuring out who's going after us. I'm pretty proud to be supporting the fight against disinformation, whether it's the Atlantic Council or others, and I'm hoping everyone will join me. This is all hands on deck, and we're all in this together. Folks, thanks.
Thank you so much, Craig. A few points just before we dive into the foreign influence attribution tracker. Follow us online, join the conversation. We're using hashtag ACElections2020. Also, if you're joining us on Zoom or anywhere else, go ahead and tag us. You can ask questions in the chat function, and we'd love for your participation. We'd love for your feedback. We'd love for you to use this tool. And with that, I'm going to pass over to resident fellow of the DFRLab, Emerson Brooking, and the research team across the DFRLab, including Alyssa Kahn, Jacqueline Malloret, Max Rizzuto, and others who have worked to make this all possible. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Graham, and thank you, Craig. And thanks to the audience for joining us today. I'm excited to introduce this new tool to the community, but I'd like to start by stepping back a few years in time. And that's back to October 7, 2016. That was on the eve of the 2016 election. A joint intelligence assessment accusing Russia of directed cyber attacks intended to benefit a specific political candidate. Now, this was an action unprecedented in modern US history, and this act of releasing this statement came only after much internal debate. And one can suspect that the civil servants and Obama appointees responsible for making that call, they understood they were making history that day, and they likely expected it to be quite a news story and to draw a lot of public attention. And to a degree, they were right. If you look at the Facebook referrals between New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal coverage of that historic accusation, it got about 45,000 Facebook referrals, a respectable performance. But of course, that wasn't the only story that day. A few hours later, the Access Hollywood tapes broke, got 400,000 Facebook referrals from the Post story alone, and they absolutely dominated horse race and broadcast media coverage for the next few days. It was a comparative giant, and unfortunately, the attribution became a Friday story that not that many folks were paying attention to. And if that wasn't bad enough, there was the Death Star of all stories, Wikileaks itself. After a failed launch earlier that week, Julian Assange and Wikileaks launched the Podesta emails archive just a few hours after that Access Hollywood story broke. And that created just shockwaves of media coverage and continuous media events, which shaped and dominated the news cycle. Now, if we're thinking about the impact of that story, the best place to look is to a Facebook Friends report from October 2016, which just captured the most popular topics on the platform. If you see where WikiLeaks is, it was a media event that got more coverage in October 2016 than the Walking Dead franchise or Breast Cancer Awareness Month. Its best point of comparison was to the World Series, which had the first Chicago Cubs victory since 1908. And it was just a bit less talked about than Halloween. So ironically, this Russian operation drowned out most meaningful reports on the Russian operation. And most Americans wouldn't learn about Russian involvement or reckon with the broader topic of foreign interference until well after November 2016. And for the disinformation studies field, and for folks who follow foreign interference, the story of the last 4 years has really been coming to grips with this moment that occurred about 4 years ago. So what do things look like today? Well, the landscape is quite a bit different. We see here the headline stories from September 2020 alone regarding allegations of foreign interference. If we look more broadly at the field, we have dozens of reporters on disinformation and foreign interference beats, where this was hardly a topic of conversation 4 years ago. We have new federal entities devoted to tracking and stopping this phenomenon. We have technology companies like Facebook and Twitter who put out regular reports and data sets in a manner that would have been unthinkable in the last election cycle. And we saw just yesterday a most recent advisory by CISA and the FBI regarding potential foreign interference, which followed previous ODNI assessments and DHS warnings which have gone back to 2019. We cannot say in this environment that we're not being warned. And indeed, it's not even a Beltway thing. According to an August Pew opinion poll, 75% of Americans believe that foreign governments will attempt to influence the 2020 election. 62% described it as a major problem. And of course, a theme for tonight's presidential debate is election integrity. But now we have kind of a very different challenge. Where in 2016, discussion of foreign interference was drowned out before it was too late. Now we're to a degree, overwhelmed by a flood of disinformation and foreign interference related stories. And the narratives and evolution of this issue are very hard to keep up with. And that's why we're here today. A goal of the DFRLab and the goal of this Foreign Interference Attribution Tracker, FIAT, is to create a comprehensive accounting of foreign interference in the 2020 elections. And to our knowledge, this is the first project of its sort. But for our team, the devil's been in the details. What is a case of foreign interference? We've had to take great care to disentangle malign foreign interference from more benign foreign influence, and to distinguish cases on the basis of novelty, and to limit our inquiry to cases that directly touch the 2020 election. We've also had to build a flexible case assessment system that lets us compare different allegations from different sources, applying our team's experience in tracking these sorts of issues. And we've had to build from the ground up system to assess the media impact of these claims using a combination of several unique social media listening tools. And most importantly, our guiding objective has been to move past simply discussing the tactics of the 2016 era Russian Internet Research Agency. There are many, many more actors in this space and many more cases, and some have moved on to more dangerous tactics and methods. Our objective is to draw attention to them and to help educate journalists, policymakers, and the general public in just how much this field has evolved and how many cases and reported incidents there now are. And this is the result of our work. This is the Foreign Interference Attribution Tracker. You can visit it right now at interference2020.org. This is the result of 4 months of work and a careful review of foreign interference cases. It currently has 65 allegations in the data set, spanning 17 responsible nations. They've received a cumulative 15 million social media shares and engagements, stories related to these different incidents. We'll be updating this tool through the election and afterward, and our objective is to provide that comprehensive history of foreign interference in the 2020 election that was so missing in 2016. And this has been a team effort. I'm happy to introduce Max Rizzuto, Jacqueline Malloray, and Alyssa Ken, who have all been part of this core effort, and they're going to take things from here. So with that, over to you, Max.
Thank you, Emerson. So, on to the visualization. Articulating the data to provide context and an earnest presentation was challenging. Evaluating these claims of foreign interference is something that is hard to conceptualize, especially in aggregate. Our visualization attempted to project these attributions of foreign interference in a way that is conscious of both the allegation and the attribution, essentially the content and the context. We believe that representing the data merely on a table, map, or chart would have done a disservice to the data and those who wish to understand it. It may also leave concepts vulnerable to misinterpretation. The subject of our visualization is discrete and unique, and therefore the visual ought to be as well. Now, before I move forward, I think it's important to mention that our data is justified about an invisible but global variable, shown here highlighted on the map. The United States is the focal point for all instances of foreign attribution. Points linked back to Russia, China, Iran, and other countries are designated only as sources, not destinations. Next slide. We aimed to combine the timeline and a map to create a flexible and engaging presentation that encourages exploration and makes new and old cases easily accessible, allowing users to experiment with and discover trends in our data. Shown here, you can see one of the filters we've added, allowing users to sort by disinformant nation. Visually identifying the act of an interference separate from the attribution of an interference presented some challenges. The good news is we had plenty to work with, and this is what we came up with. Next slide. The paths that trace the connections between the timeline and the map cue the viewer to the number of nations included in a given attribution. A case that may be traced back to a number of nations is then unified above the fold, becoming a single entity once it passes through the timeline's x-axis. This case is then illustrated as a point, and its relative height, saturation, and diameter indicate additional information about the attribution. This mechanism allows us to uncover and tell stories that a spreadsheet simply cannot. Next slide. Functionally, the use of filters and the ability to isolate cases works to help viewers uncover stories within the data. Sorting by attribution score, as represented by the saturation of a point, social media engagement as represented by the diameter and position on the y-axis, and a number of other variables allows visitors to play with and learn from our data. Next slide. The addition of contextual data serves to frame attributions to reveal with real-world events. At this time, the coronavirus cases and deaths overlay, a dataset courtesy of the New York Times, contextualizes attributions linked to China in a way that distinguishes them within the dataset. The visual is designed to scale and accommodate additional cases and contextual datasets, and we look forward to seeing how interference2020.org grows in the coming months. And with that, I'll pass it off to Jacqueline.
So the attribution score is intended to rate the quality and substance of each attribution in the data set. It's shown in the visualization in terms of the saturation of each bubble representing a case and is navigable via a sliding bar in the upper left hand of the screen. In this graphic, an attribution which received a higher score is boxed in green, while a more transparent attribution which received a lower score is boxed in red. Next. So the attribution score is composed of 18 characteristics or standards, which we determined crucial to assessing the credibility and nature of each attribution in the data set. The important thing about the attribution score is that it's not intended to be a corroboration nor a fact check, but instead an assessment of the information provided from each actor as it makes a disclosure or an allegation of foreign interference. Next. So the attribution score encompasses 4 categories: credibility, objectivity, evidence, and transparency. Each set is intended to rank a different factor that we considered essential to understanding and the substance of each attribution. So first and foremost, credibility attempts to assess the consequences and interest of each actor, whether it be the government, civil society organizations, or technology companies issuing these sorts of attributions in relation to the 2020 election. The second category is objectivity, which assesses the language used in the attribution, whether it uses high inference or emotive language, and how the attribution is attempting to lead the audience, or how it is trying to inform the audience about the allegation it is presenting. Next slide. Evidence attempts to rate and assess the evidence provided by each actor. It shows how much the audience is able to gather about the nature of the information operation that is being disclosed. And then finally, transparency refers to how the actor makes its evidence public for corroboration and verification by independent media and researchers. The idea being that more groups who can assess a potential information operation will be able to have a better understanding and synopsis of the action which occurred. Next slide. So you can see the whole system working in tandem now, as the slider allows you to sort the data set by the nature of attribution scores. At the end of the day, this is a subjective score. However, this has been mitigated by peer review and extensive conversation among the research team. However, this is an iterative standard that will evolve as the nature of foreign interference attributions change and as they already have become more frequent. But our hope for this guideline is twofold: that first and foremost, it can be used as an industry standard to compose attributions or disclosures of foreign interference, and that it can be used as a guideline by researchers, educators, and the general public to understand and assess the vast amount of foreign interference attributions that are made. And with that, I'll pass it to Alyssa.
Thanks, Jacqueline. So I'm going to talk about the impact of foreign interference allegations on the media ecosystem. So what is the impact of a case and why does it matter? When we talk about impact in a disinformation studies field, we're talking about how a piece of disinformation or an interference allegation changes the information environment. So how it impacts general discourse, the media, the social media ecosystem, and eventually how it impacts actions in public policy. While it's quite challenging to measure these intangibles, it's also critical in order to understand how foreign interference allegations are affecting our society. For example, a spurious and false foreign interference attempt could still be as successful as a real one by percolating through our information environment and sowing doubt and stoking fears about electoral legitimacy. So we defined impact here as articles and social media engagement. We sought to capture both all web articles around a case, as well as the social media engagement, including Facebook, Twitter, and Reddit interactions about all those articles. Next slide. So how did we get all our data? We used a variety of tools to acquire data. They're on the left. Some to get the links for each case, and some to get the social media buzz about each of those links. So we recorded Facebook, Twitter, and Reddit engagement for each link, and then computed the aggregate social media scores, as well as the aggregate article count per case. So on the left, you can see an example of individual link-by-link data for a case. And on the right, the aggregate social media data for multiple cases. We were specifically interested in the immediate internet aftermath of an allegation. So we only collected links which occurred within a week of the initial attribution. Next slide, please. So what did we find? This process yielded many interesting findings about how online impact did and did not correlate with an allegation's electoral significance. And certain allegations drove buzz more than others. For example, when we calculated the average aggregate social media engagement per link for each case, we found that the case with the highest social media buzz per link, with a whopping 17K social media interactions per link, was actually the Chinese ambassador on Twitter, implying that the US was responsible for COVID-19. And as Jacqueline talked about, the attribution score for this case was quite low. Of particular note is the two polls of our data. So the highest engagement and the highest number of articles was a case with over 2 million social media interactions, over 900 articles. And this was an attribution by US intelligence broken by the Washington Post that Russia was interfering on behalf of Bernie Sanders in February 2020. In contrast, the lowest engagement and the lowest number of articles was about the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg accusing China and Russia of disinformation. This case had less than 200 engagements and really only a few articles. So with those highlights noted, I'm going to pass it back to Emerson.
Alyssa, thank you very much. And for everyone following along, again, you can visit interference2020.org now or right after this presentation to examine, use, and play with this tool. And please let us know via Twitter or email thoughts and feedback on its functionality. And now with that, I am happy to turn to the next part of our presentation and honored to welcome I am honored to welcome two distinguished panelists to carry this conversation forward. Both were at the vanguard following Russian interference in 2016, and they've relentlessly tracked this issue through its many twists and turns ever since. Natasha Bertrand is national security correspondent for Politico and a political analyst for NBC and MSNBC. David Sanger is a national security correspondent and senior writer of the New York Times. He's the author, most recently, of The Perfect Weapon, War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, which will have an HBO documentary of the same name out October 16. And a reminder to all following along, this is a moderated question and answer session, so please ask questions. Simply input your questions now or later using the Zoom Q&A function. And our hope is to get to as many questions as possible. And for my first question to this group, I want to start with the 2016 election, and we have a short clip from David's documentary to help jumpstart that discussion.
2,000 more emails have been posted online, apparently from the hacked account of Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman, John Podesta.
Thousands of hacked emails from her campaign chairman, John Podesta.
Third installment of the hacked emails from Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman, John Podesta. And so far, the messages have provided a look into the inner workings of the Clinton camp.
Most of those ended up being of little import. I'm a boring sort of guy.
One email reveals a disagreement between top Clinton aide Huma Abedin and Podesta over Clinton's press strategy.
A lot of this was gossip.
In another email, a longtime Clinton aide refers to Chelsea Clinton as a, quote, spoiled brat.
But people thought, well, if it's secret or if it's stolen, it must be more sexy. It's kind of shadowy. They didn't want you to know this, but...
Like any good peek behind the curtains, they show things the campaign obviously would rather keep under wraps.
The Clinton emails are fascinating and hilarious reading in some ways.
So is it more like Veep or is it more like West Wing?
We were very frustrated. The fact that this was a hostile foreign government interfering in the election was never really part of what the coverage was.
I would just add, this should be of concern to everyone that the Russians are trying to influence our election.
Everybody was clearly informed about my email mistakes, but they didn't know there was an active campaign against us by the Russians. They did not know that the Trump campaign had personnel associated with it who were also being investigated. If you look at Trump's campaign the last month, he mentioned Wikileaks over 160 times, and they used the most perverse twisting of anything in John Podesta's emails to create controversy and sow distrust.
A Russian news outlet just totally misrepresented one of these emails, and then Donald Trump read it.
She's now admitting that they could have done something about Benghazi. This just came out a little while ago.
There was like an email story every day, and then Comey drops this hand grenade on us.
The October surprise came in the form of a 3-paragraph letter to Congress from FBI Director James Comey, who wrote that agents on an unrelated case had learned of the existence of emails that appear to be pertinent to the Clinton investigation.
It's the wilderness of mirrors now in terms of investigation upon investigation.
So that is quite a poignant step back in time. And at this point in 2016, most Americans would not have heard about the foreign interference issue. The DNC hacking issue would have been framed primarily through the content of these leaked emails. And of course, the Obama administration's single public attribution on October 7 was drowned out by quite a few other stories that day. So I'm curious for both of you, as both of you were very much reporting out this subject, what was it like to cover this foreign interference and this first foreign interference attribution as it happened? And I'll turn first to David.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks so much for having me, and it's great to be back rejoining Natasha. And thanks for running that bit of a clip from what John Maggio and his group of wizards at Arc Media and HBO did with the book. The line that resonated with me the most out of the Podesta interview that you saw there, pieces of it you saw there, was his wilderness of mirrors description, because that's exactly what the Russians wanted to create. They wanted to create this buzz around the emails that focused everybody on the juicy infighting inside the inside the candidacy of Hillary Clinton, rather than on the many things about Donald Trump that people were busy arguing about at the time. I would disagree slightly with John on the question of whether or not Americans knew that the Russians had done this. I mean, it was June that CrowdStrike came out and announced that the Russians had been inside the DNC. We probably wrote 24 stories between that time and Election Day about what the Russians were doing. But I do have sympathy for him on this, that when we also wrote stories from the content of the emails, that effort by the DNC to give Bernie Sanders as little attention as possible and money as possible, that aides to Secretary Clinton who were describing the shortcomings of her candidacy and so forth. I don't think we did a good enough job making the point, hey, you're reading this because Vladimir Putin wants you to read it. And I think on that issue, Podesta's got it just right, that the connective tissue wasn't quite there. I think if there was a hack and leak now, we'd probably do a better job of it, but we'd all be debating by repeating the hacked material, whatever it is, are we falling into Putin's trap?
Yeah, I totally agree with David. I mean, I think that we are much better prepared this time around for a hack and leak operation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're fully guarded against it. Newsrooms have been issuing guidelines in recent days and weeks about how to deal with this kind of thing so that we don't repeat the mistakes of 2016 and essentially be used as tools of foreign adversaries to influence the election. But I do think that we are overall better equipped to deal with this now because we're aware that it's happening. We're aware that this is a possibility, that in 2016, we were totally unequipped to deal with the onslaught of the social media campaigns and the disinformation efforts. And I mean, it wasn't just us. I mean, it was the entire US government, right? I mean, the entire intelligence community really did not see any of this coming. So I think now that we're seeing more and more warnings being put out by the intelligence community, trying to prepare Americans for the prospect of widespread disinformation about the integrity of the election, about a certain candidate. In terms of this election specifically, it's Russia denigrating Joe Biden yet again. And with the media being aware that there are going to be moments when, you know, we're going to be tested with potentially tantalizing information that could be damaging to one candidate or another, where that information is coming from. I think that we are in a much better mindset than we were 4 years ago. So I would be more reassured moving into this election in the next month or so, knowing that we've been through this once before. Obviously, it's never going to be perfect, but we have lived through the experience. So I think that we're better fortified to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. So it's clear that newsrooms have done quite a lot of reflection since 2016 in preparation for what's unfolding right now. But I'm curious if you could speak a bit to the broader public discourse around the foreign interference issue as well, because it's gone from, you know, essentially a non-factor in 2016 to it does seem a topic of quite a bit of debate. And there was a period of time, you know, if you're an active Twitter user, where you essentially could be called a Russian bot under any circumstances. So as we think about the broader public perceptions of this foreign interference issue, has there been an overcorrection, or are there things we can do to make this dialogue healthier for the general public?
Well, I've been called a lot worse things on Twitter than a Russian bot, let me tell you, and many of which you would not want to repeat at a good Atlantic Council event. But I think we've done, I think we risk a couple of traps we can fall into. One is, it's not just the Russians now. The nature of cyber activity generally is one of success and then imitation. So the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, probably many others, saw that for a tiny investment of money, Putin got a huge return for what he was doing in 2016, tremendous return. And look at it this way, we're still talking about it at Atlantic Council events like this one 4 years later. And, you know, the investment that they made in this couldn't have been more than a couple $100,000 or a couple $1 million. So I think one trap we run into is assuming it's the Russians at all points, when in fact we've seen other actors out there. The second trap is, I think, assuming that the Russians haven't evolved in 4 years. They learned a lot from 2016 as well. They learned what they did well. They learned what they didn't do well. They learned that this time Facebook and Twitter and others are ready for them. So we're seeing new and different techniques. Nicole Perlroth and I wrote the other day in the Times about the concern that ransomware, which so far has been aimed at cities and towns, but not really at the election infrastructure, could be planting the seeds for an attack right around election day that would freeze up registration systems, maybe electronic poll books, that could do some damage to one's confidence that your vote is actually being counted. They could mess up scanning systems. I mean, think of it. If you really wanted to screw up election day, you wouldn't have to do it all across the country. You just need to find a few vulnerable cities and towns and conduct a perception hack that made people assume that everything else is vulnerable as well. So I think the second big concern that I have is the guesswork that if it doesn't look just like 2016, we must be home clear. And the third possibility is the Russians will look at this election and decide maybe that, Trump can't be saved or that Biden's going down or something like that, and decide that the most mischief they could do is kind of pull back and wait for everybody to accuse each other that there are Russians behind each and every move.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there is the risk of inadvertently amplifying disinformation in trying to combat it, right? I mean, that's one of the issues that we grapple with all the time is how do you report responsibly on these efforts while at the same time not giving them too much attention and making them too overblown and scaring people unnecessarily. I do think that's always an issue that you have to balance. There have been examples in recent weeks and months of things getting a little bit too blown out of proportion, and that's exactly what the Russians want, obviously, and any other foreign adversary, frankly, that's trying to interfere in the election. So that's definitely another trap that we try to avoid as journalists. But, I also think that when we think about, when I speak to officials now, they're exactly worried about what David was just saying, that there could be a kind of 11th hour operation that they just haven't detected yet that could interfere with the election in a way that they just haven't prepared for. And one thing they say is, well, we haven't really been seeing as much activity in the election infrastructure this time around, certainly not the level of activity that we saw in 2016. But what are we missing then? Where are they interfering more? Is there something that we're not seeing? And that is what kind of keeps them awake at night, is this possibility that they're just missing some broader campaign that either the Russians, the Chinese, or the Iranians are waging that is just out of public sight for now, and that will come out, in some kind of October surprise or even on the eve of the election. So I think that's been part of what's informing the intelligence community's more their increased transparency about foreign efforts this time around in a way that we didn't see in 2016. So the FBI, for example, the nation's top counterintel official, Bill Evanina, them releasing statements saying that these are all things that could be done prior to the election to try to sow doubt in Americans' minds about the legitimacy of the campaign and of the actual vote. That is, I think, also planting the seed in people's minds that if something were to happen on the eve of the election, then they at least know that it's not necessarily something to worry about. It could just be disinformation, chaos. It could just be more of, these foreign adversaries trying to sow doubt in people's minds about the legitimacy of the election. So I think that that's been a particularly helpful change that we've seen in the last 4 years.
Mm-hmm. So you've each spoken about the evolution of foreign tactics, about what seems to be an increased frequency of perception hacking, and then also the concern you have in highlighting the right issues and not blowing some things out of proportion. I'm curious, in your assessment of this field, are there stories that you believe have received inadequate public attention at this point as we go into October? And are there particular stories that you think have received maybe a bit too much public attention?
Does Natasha want to go first? I've got my list, but her list is probably more interesting.
No, go ahead. It's all you.
So the big missing factor here, we know the public warnings that have been made, right? And we know the identifications that have happened. And we know that Microsoft and Google and Facebook have all turned out some,
in that have been used in recent years, and a lot of that report focused on kind of these obscure websites that have been putting out disinformation, and inadvertently, I believe, kind of amplifying them. Obviously, it's it's always a risk that some of this information is going to get picked up by fringe right-wing websites, and then it's going to be filtered into the broader right-wing or left-wing ecosphere. But I think that there's, a more pressing issue, which is exactly what David was just saying, which is what are we doing to actually deter the potentially crippling cyber attacks that could happen? And what are we learning about the Trump administration's willingness to push back on the Russians in this way, especially heading into 2020? I mean, this is not a favorite topic of the president's, obviously. He has been extremely reluctant to hold Vladimir Putin accountable for anything. And so one thing that I would like to see more reporting on is, is the president actually actively deterring or preventing his national security team from preventing a potential Russian attack? I imagine that he wouldn't be as reluctant to maybe prevent a Chinese or an Iranian interference campaign, because the intel community has assessed that the Chinese would actually prefer that Biden win. And so in that sense, he sees it as actively against his interests. But with regard to this threat, which intel officials also say is the most acute leading into the 2020 election from Russia, what is the president and his intel agencies, what are they actually doing about it in terms of the concrete kind of cyber warfare battle space?
Emerson, one more point on this. We've had very few moments of direct understanding of the president's own involvement. He told Bob Woodward somewhat unconvincingly that he had ordered the pushback in 2018 during the midterm elections. But what we know is that he had issued in August of 2018 a rewriting of the authorities for U.S. Cyber Command that essentially gave to General Paul Nakasone, the commander of Cyber Command and director of the NSA, the authority to go conduct these kinds of operations without getting presidential approval. And if you're Paul Nakasone under these conditions, you're probably thinking, the less I bother the president with the details of what we're doing to push back on the Russians, probably the better. He's a busy man. Why would you necessarily want to go swamp him with details on this, right? So he's got to keep his head down. We do know that when we reported in the Times last year that the US had put code inside the Russian electric grid as a warning to the Russians about the code they put in our electric grid. That story ran, I think it was posted on a Saturday for a Sunday paper, and Saturday night, I remember sitting at dinner and somebody calls me and says, well, the president's just tweeted about your story. And he said, oh, geez, just what we needed. But we look at the tweet and he said that the New York Times had conducted an act of virtual treason by revealing this. Then somebody must have come by and explained to him that he had just confirmed our story. So a few minutes later, there was a second tweet that said, and it's wrong. And I said to some White House friends the next Monday, look, you guys got to pick. Either we conducted an act of treason, and by the way, we ran the entire story by the NSC, and they said to us, we have no problem if you run this. They had written the code for the Russians to see it. I said, either it's treason or it's wrong, but it can't be treasonous and wrong. You got to pick. They didn't pick.
Mm-hmm. So I think, to put it lightly, as you describe, and with a lot of other executive agencies, there's a bit of friction in dealing with electoral security and foreign interference in this administration. And in the end of August, ODNI announced that it would be suspending in-person congressional briefings on the issue of electoral security, citing unauthorized disclosures of information. Senate Select Committee's, final report in its investigation of Russian foreign interference, it gives a list of recommendations, and a big one, and a big warning that they highlight is the growing politicization of this entire topic. The idea that foreign interference discussions are so close to electoral politics and there's such a temptation to leak. I'm wondering, in your assessments, is it possible to prevent the politicization of foreign interference? And is there a way to kind of draw a line between this discussion of electoral politics and discussion of this phenomenon is a national security threat?
I mean, there should be. It shouldn't be a political issue, but obviously anything that has to do with a campaign or an election, it's going to be political. But I think that probably the person that's been politicizing it the most is the president himself. We've seen that in his concerted efforts since 2016 to call this a hoax, to say that the Russians deny it, to say that his own intel services, are he compared them to Nazis at one point. I mean, I think that if we had leadership perhaps from the top who were trying to unify on this issue rather than be divisive about it, and rather than say, no, it was the Democrats that conspired with the Russians, or it was the Iranians that are trying to get the Clintons elected, or whatever, rather than say this is the Russians are going to keep interfering, or whoever's going to keep interfering for the exact purpose of continuing to divide us, then it might be less of a political issue. But I also think, the hawks in Congress who were more willing to hold these actors accountable, perhaps people like John McCain, for example, really aren't there anymore. So now it's become so split on partisan lines that it's hard to imagine that even with Joe Biden in office, this is going to get any better, because people are already kind of lining up to say, well, China is helping Joe Biden get elected. There's already this narrative forming that China is interfering to help Joe Biden win. And it's kind of the revenge tactic for the IC's assessment in 2016 that the Russians interfered specifically to bolster Trump's candidacy. So already we're seeing these narratives take shape, and it just shows that the politicization of this issue from a national security perspective is just not going to go away anytime soon.
Emerson, it's hard to imagine how this could not be politicized. Lots of intelligence gets politicized, and it's been the case for a long, long time. And, our most recent examples have all been pretty much in the nuclear sphere. But, we saw a lot of politics about when one would declare that the Soviets would have nuclear capability to counter us, which happened in the 40s, when the Chinese would have it, whether India and Pakistan would have it, whether we would bust the Pakistanis for doing so because we needed them in counterterrorism after 9/11. And of course, famously, the Iraq War and the politicization of the intelligence there. So why one would think that this would be any different? It's just a different form of intelligence on a slightly different set of issues and scale. But I think you had to expect that it would be. The hard part here is that, as Natasha pointed out, we get these briefings, very good briefings from very serious players inside the US government. She named a few of them, who are working really hard to make this a transparent, well-run election in which they're promising to call out any indications by the Russians or anyone else who are trying to make Americans believe that their vote won't be counted, that the vote isn't legitimate, that we won't get a accountable outcome at the end. And then they go home at night and they turn on the president's Twitter feed and they're getting accounts about how your vote won't be counted. And last night it was, we're already hearing about trouble with the mail-in ballots. And, a few days ago, it was all about the Iowa case, which was a mess, not a foreign interference mess, but just people not understanding the new technology that they were putting in place. And their problem is that we've got a bureaucracy running in one direction on this election and a president running on the other, and the Russians and others taking their signals from the president.
Mm-hmm. And this leads quite neatly into my final question before we turn to the audience. And this is a bit speculative, but forgive me, we're rapidly approaching the presidential election. And it's the case that when we think about the political discourse around foreign interference, it's been very much driven by Democrats who want to investigate the Russian operation and who want to get answers. And it's been stonewalled to quite an extent by a president who feels that this investigation draws into question his democratic mandate. Now, we're approaching a point soon where this dynamic could be very different. There could be a Biden administration and then, say, a Republican Senate minority. And the Trump administration has already, say, emphasized Chinese foreign interference to quite an extent more than I think the broader disinformation studies community has. And the Biden team has struck quite a strident tone with regard to Russia and I guess getting answers for this foreign interference. So my question to you is, if there is a Biden administration starting in 2021, how do you think this broader discourse around foreign interference is going to change?
I mean, as I said earlier, I think that it's going to get ugly. I think that there is already a narrative forming that the Chinese are trying to bolster Joe Biden's candidacy and that they are trying to help elect him, and that is going to be part of a broader effort to delegitimize his presidency in a way that the Trump supporters said that the Russian interference was a way to delegitimize his. So I think that it's just going to go on in this cycle, really regardless of the actual analysis, because again, as David said, it's all going to be politicized one way or another. There's really no way around it. I do think that a Joe Biden administration will probably be more aggressive about calling out the Russian activity and malign influence efforts in the United States than Trump himself has been, certainly. So the narrative may shift a bit on that front, but I don't think that it's just going to go away magically if Joe Biden is elected, unfortunately.
No, I'm not entirely persuaded that the Chinese are better off with Joe Biden than they are with Donald Trump. And it was only a few years ago that the Democrats were considered the more anti-China group because of the trade and labor issues and so forth. TPP, negotiated by Obama with Biden as vice president, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, excluded China, right? That was designed to be an anti-China grouping. And if you're the Chinese, you might think that the one thing about Donald Trump is he's pretty transactional, and they would know what they would need to do to strike a deal with him. They may not like the deal, but they know what they would need to do. It was interesting that when Microsoft reported there were more Chinese-related attacks to steal emails from the Biden campaign than anything they saw from the Trump campaign, directed at the Trump campaign. And that may simply be that the Biden campaign is more of a mystery to the Chinese. They think they know what's going on in the Trump administration, or they have other intelligence assets at work on those issues. That said, I think we have to get accustomed to the fact not only that this is going to be a permanent feature of American politics, but that it could get really very ugly between November 3rd and January 20th. If there is a disputed election, there will be questions about whether or not people got disinformation, whether they were able to go to the polls, whether the ballots were counted correctly. That will have both a domestic and perhaps a foreign element to it. And remember, it wasn't really until after the election that we learned the most about what happened in 2016.
Good point.
So that leads quite nicely into our first audience question from Sebastian Bay, which is, to what extent US media have been able to build the resources needed to cover this influence issue and do their part in countering foreign influence with regard to the upcoming election. To what extent they've been able to have in-house access to experts and in-house data resources, pre-research stories, and the like. And also how much pre-planning can go into anticipating a contested election, which there'll be a huge volume of this disinformation circulating, which is itself also a question of newsroom bandwidth.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that newsrooms have still been they've been trying to educate, obviously, on the issue of disinformation and trying to be less reactive, and trying to ensure that journalists are prepared for any number of breaking news events, whether they come from the foreign adversaries or from the president himself, especially when it comes to contesting the election. One thing that's been kind of drilled into us is not rushing to declare a winner on election night, not rushing to Twitter to say that, you know, Joe Biden is ahead by this, or Trump, taking Trump's tweets that he has declared victory at face value, things like that. Just being very, very cautious about amplifying anything really the night of, because this is not going to be an election night. It's going to be an election week or weeks. And I think another facet of this effort has been to try to educate the public and try to emphasize patience, that this is not going to be something that they are immediately satisfied by, that this is probably going to take a while. And obviously that's something that the president is already trying to sow distrust in, saying that that is going to be proof that the election is illegitimate and rigged. So what's really been emphasized to us as reporters is just to not blare the president's, you know, tweets and misinformation in headlines. Be careful about what we say and write, not only on election night, but in the days leading up to it and the days and weeks after. And of course, always being aware of the source of potentially damaging information to one candidate or another that may be planted by foreign actors.
Emerson, Natasha's got it exactly right about the need to wait, do this calmly. You know, a couple of years ago, I was talking to a group of journalism students, and unfortunately, I'm sorry to admit this, but you guys have figured it out by looking at us. I've been doing this for a little bit, probably longer than Natasha has. And one of the questions that the students asked me was, what are the stories you're proudest of? And I was about to go give them a list. And I said, let me also give you a list of the stories that I didn't write that I'm proudest of. And, you know, those are the times when, despite the great pressure that we all feel, and we all feel it in very accelerated ways, to go be first and get it out onto the website first, onto our news feeds, onto our apps, onto our Twitter accounts, we're the ones that you want to take the big, deep breath and say, you know, I may not be first, but let me also not leap off the cliff here. People have been trying to game out what election night's going to look like. We don't know. I mean, maybe it'll be a blowout for one of the candidates or another, in which case we may all be declaring things on election night. I doubt it. Maybe the president is going to declare an early victory, so that as perfectly legitimate votes get counted as the mail-in ballots come in, he'll be able to say, well, I was ahead in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, fill in the blank, whatever state it is, until somebody worked on taking it away from me. Well, no, until somebody worked on counting the votes fully. So I suspect that we're all going to have to use extraordinary caution. I think the bigger question is, what do we do when there's a big hack and leak, if there is one? I saw that the Washington Post turned out some fairly lengthy guidelines the other day. I thought that was wise about how to sort of think about hack and leak. I know we've been talking about the same kind of issues in our newsroom, and there have been groups that have been set up that bring reporters together from different news organizations that discuss how we would handle these kinds of things. But it's very difficult to sort of build a plan for every eventuality. And, you know, the key to newsrooms is flexibility.
So a reminder to the audience, we have about 20 minutes left, and two foremost experts on this topic. So please get in your questions. I want to combine two here. One from Mehdi, who asks, we keep hearing about Iran as one of the foreign actors trying to influence the 2020 elections, and it's been mentioned several times this evening. But could you explain a bit more what evidence there is that really implicates Iran in foreign interference efforts? Because it is often lumped in with Russia, but the facts may be quite different. And as a related question from Dania at the VOA Russian service, they ask, do we see any coordination between Russia and China, and presumably Iran, in attacks on the US election so far?
I'll tell you what, I'll take the first if Natasha will take the second. the Iranians have had a cyber group for a while. They really ramped it up after Olympic Games, which was the code name for the Stuxnet attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities. And they did a very big attack that ended up sending a lot of financial institutions reeling in 2012. And then they went after the Sands Casino in Las Vegas. Can you imagine anything nastier than going after a country's casinos? I mean, really, talk about going against the heart of America. And for those who may want to tune in to the Perfect Weapon documentary, we went to Las Vegas and sort of reconstructed the Sands Casino hack with many of the people who would work there at the time, because it gave you a real sense of what it was the Iranians could do. But doing a hack and doing an effective information operation those are two very different skill sets. And I think that what we've seen them do so far has been pretty amateurish, but they were present in 2018, trying some sort of very basic information operations. I haven't seen any evidence so far of cooperation, but maybe Natasha has.
No, I haven't heard from any officials that I've spoken to that there's evidence of coordination between the Chinese and the Russians in terms of malign influence efforts in the United States. And I think that's primarily because they have divergent goals. I think that, the Chinese have always been more about spying and just general espionage, and less about causing chaos and more about stealing intellectual property, and less about influencing campaigns one way or another. So, for example, the statement that was put out a few weeks ago by the IC noted that while the Chinese do have a preference for Joe Biden, they didn't necessarily give any proof for that or evidence. But they said that they seem to have a preference based on the reports that they've read. They stopped short of saying that they were actively interfering to tilt the needle one way or another. Whereas the Russians have been interfering with the goal of denigrating Joe Biden, with the goal of sowing chaos about things like mail-in voting, and just have a different strategic mindset than the Chinese do. So I think if they were to work together, their goals would probably have to align a little bit more. And so far, I haven't seen any evidence from anyone that I've spoken to anyway that they are.
Mm-hmm. So shifting gears a bit, we have a question regarding big tech. And in particular, I think the attributions that have come most frequently from Facebook and Twitter. Question is, essentially, from your perspective, having covered this issue so closely, how would you rate the technology company response in this area on the eve of 2020 as compared to 2016, but then also thinking about where we actually need to be, since so much of these attacks and operations rely on these technology services?
The two kinds of response, there's exposure, and then there is, for the social media companies, what they decide they're going to either flag or block from their sites. I would give them fairly high grades for exposure. I think Microsoft has done some really good work, and they turned out another really interesting report earlier this morning that sort of summarizes state actors and so forth. I think Google's done some very good work. The harder question for Facebook and for Twitter and for other social media isn't how good a job they're doing at letting us know what they're seeing. I think that also has been impressive. It's how well are they making the editorial judgments about what they're going to allow on or not. What do you do when you have Americans with real First Amendment rights who are not inauthentic actors putting out stuff that they clearly are either getting from or feeding to the Russians or other players, including the president? And this is a really hard issue, because in 2016, it was one thing to say, oh, they missed all of the inauthentic actors. Well, now they're beginning to pick up inauthentic activity and banning people, not on the basis of the content, but on the fact that, I'm pretending to be Emerson, but I'm sitting in St. Petersburg, at the Internet Research Agency. The hard issue that they're facing right now is, what do you do when the Russians have put out a line and actual real life Americans have picked it up and maybe believe it and are exercising their First Amendment rights to go repeat that? That's not inauthentic activity. And that makes this a particularly hard problem.
Yeah, I think that the tech companies are more willing to grapple with the issue now than they were 4 years ago, which is a start, because they were, according to, people that have come out and written books about this in the last 4 years, about the FBI investigations that went on, about just the broader efforts to track down the Russian interference campaign and its impacts. The tech companies were very reluctant to do any kind of information sharing with the FBI on the subject, or any kind of law enforcement partners on this. So now there is more of that information sharing going on and more collaboration, and there is less of a reluctance to come out and identify, as David said, expose these influence operations that are happening on their platforms. I think every other week or so, we're seeing Facebook come out with a big newsroom announcement saying that they've taken down X number of Russian or Chinese or Iranian or wherever inauthentic accounts. But again, you run into this issue of the tech platforms and the free speech, and Twitter, I think, has done a pretty good job of checking misinformation and disinformation on its platform, for example, by including banners on a lot of the president's tweets, labeling them essentially disinformation, and encouraging Twitter users to educate themselves on a particular subject that he is lying about, for lack of a better word. And whereas Facebook is still lagging behind on this issue, kind of allowing a lot of this stuff to stay up on its platform, taking a more kind of laissez-faire approach to all of it. So we are definitely seeing some platforms doing more than others on the subject, and I think it's just a philosophical difference. But I think that the broader trend of increased awareness about manipulation by foreign actors is heading in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. So we have an excellent question from Rowan at GIJN, specifically on influence operations, because certainly you deal with a tremendous number of leads, which don't always develop into foreign interference stories. But in your assessment, what mix are you seeing in terms of, in 2020, the teenage Macedonian entrepreneurs at it again, versus these more sophisticated operations? And just more generally, as we think about the evolution of these influence operations and attributions, do you think this field is getting more professionalized or more amateurish?
Natasha, you want to weigh in first on Macedonian teenagers? Because I haven't covered a whole lot about that. I haven't written much about that.
I haven't either. I mean, it was obviously just a massive fake news operation that was being churned out for profit. But I think something that David mentioned earlier on in this conversation about the Russians changing their tactics, we'll just stick with the Russians for now, and just for my purposes, because they are just a very acute threat, I think, to this election particularly. But so, for example, what the Russians are doing is finding new ways to launder their disinformation through the public, right? Especially the American public. So one actor that they have used, that the intelligence community actually called out in a pretty unprecedented way a few weeks ago, is a Ukrainian lawmaker by the name of Andriy Derkach, who has been passing information to Congress about Joe Biden that is negative, has been amplifying negative information about the Democratic candidate for the better part of a year, and has been using a congressional investigation essentially to legitimize the dirt that he is throwing at the candidate. And what the intelligence community concluded is that this is actually someone who is directly connected to Russian intel services. This is someone who is, again, they didn't offer proof for this. They didn't, get into sources and methods of how they knew this, but suggesting that this was potentially a new way that the Russians were trying to inject this disinformation into the discourse. And it has stuck. A lot of what Dirk Hatch has been saying about Joe Biden and Hunter Biden in Ukraine has been picked up and amplified by the president, by his supporters, by his campaign, by his allies in Congress. And we're now seeing that it's going to be a chief debate line for the president tonight. So these bad actors in Ukraine, who are, according to the intel community, being directed by the Russians, have managed to inject this into the American mainstream to the point where it's going to be broadcast to millions of people's homes tonight during the debate. So, and again, it was legitimized by a congressional investigation that was conducted by a Republican senator. So this is a new way, I think, of them trying to get around the issue of the media becoming more savvy to their efforts, because in 2016, it was pretty simple for them to launder all of this disinformation, hacked materials through the press. The media was very, just unskeptical about it all in 2016 and very unwilling to discern the origins of the information that it was receiving. But now I think we're more on guard to that. The tech companies are more fortified against that. And so they've established new ways to inject this into the mainstream. It's by no means a brand new technique, right? Kind of using an agent to disseminate these kind of influence operations in another country, but it is new in terms of how they've developed their tactics and tried to get around the increased awareness following 2016. So I definitely think that that's something that's been successful for them. Again, because it's just listen tonight, it's going to be amplified by the president.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting question. I think Natasha raises a critical issue. If you're Joe Biden, how do you respond to this? I mean, he could say, hey, Mr. President, the information you're doing out here comes from one guy named Dirk Hatch in Ukraine, who your own Treasury Department sanctioned last week. Well, who's right out here? Is your Treasury Secretary right or not? The problem with that is that it plays in, of course, to President Trump's desire to make that the topic and not, how he handled coronavirus or how he's handling the economy or any of the other current issues. And so, it risks getting the vice president right into the wrestling match there. And so this is a question of, during a presidential campaign and during a presidential debate, can you get into the attribution business without leaving everybody completely confused?
Mm-hmm. So as we bring up Dirk Hatch and as we reflect back on a strange interlude with tapes of conversations between the former Ukrainian president and Vice President Joe Biden, which leaked in what appeared to be a Russian operation earlier in the summer. From your perspective now, as we enter that final critical month and where we can look forward to October surprises, or rather additional ones, do you think we are going to encounter a similar hack and release effort that hasn't dropped yet? And then a related question from Mehdi, and I love the way he puts this: should we expect a homegrown James Comey-esque clanger before the 3rd of November?
I think that everyone is preparing for the possibility of a hack and leak because the Russians have been hacking, right? I mean, they haven't stopped. And one of the organizations that they hacked earlier this year, I believe it was the New York Times actually that first reported this, was Burisma, which is the energy company that Hunter Biden sat on the board of, that has now become at the center of all of this disinformation surrounding Joe Biden and Hunter and alleged corruption in Ukraine. So kind of whether they were fishing for documents in there and whether, things are going to be released that are altered or that are edited in any way to try to amplify that narrative about corruption that Trump has been trying to pin on Joe Biden and his son, that I think is something that even the Biden campaign has been preparing for. I mean, people you speak to who are monitoring this issue daily, monitoring disinformation for the campaign, say, yes, we are fully, expecting and we're preparing for the worst, and we are that's why we're trying to kind of raise awareness about this issue and about all of the disinformation efforts surrounding this issue leading up to the election, because we don't really know what we don't know, right? So I think that it's not just the media that's preparing for it, it's also the campaign itself.
It's going to be a hard uphill fight to get through October and not have something that we're thinking of as the October surprise. Now, there are some people who think that President Trump doesn't need one now. He's had a Supreme Court appointment to go make, and the fight over the confirmation may well be the issue that he needs to galvanize everyone. There's some speculation that the administration would see some utility in having some kind of confrontation with the Iranians, maybe in Iraq, maybe someplace else. And then there's always the possibility that you could see hackers try to go do the equivalent of what they did on October 7th, 2016, which is the events that led to the release of the Podesta emails. And remember, the Podesta emails were not stolen in October. They were stolen back in March or April of 2016, and they held on to them until October. So it could be that whatever you're going to see in October has been sitting around on somebody's hard drive for a good part of the year, or maybe goes back to last year. As Natasha points out, they probably got those discussions between Biden and the Ukrainian president some time ago. So it's very hard to call it. I think the big question isn't really what they do, it's how smart we are and how we react.
So we have time for two more questions. And the first regards government responses and awareness, just generally around foreign interference attributions. We got this warning yesterday from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, joint with the FBI, regarding disinformation about hacking, targeting voting systems. And it follows a number of government announcements in recent months, which have come from different agencies and which have been, I know in some cases, very much the work of devoted civil servants and individuals who want to draw attention to this stuff through the US government. But from your perspective covering this and thinking about moving forward, how can government break through when there are these clear attacks with confidential signals intelligence? And how can that message most effectively be disseminated? And are we taking the right steps to ensure that the American public are informed?
I think it's better than nothing, honestly. I think that the government was probably, the Obama administration was rightly criticized in 2016 for not saying anything until October 7th, which of course was the day of the Access Hollywood tape and the day of the Wikileaks release of the Podesta emails, just attributing all of this chaos and the hacks to Russia. And I think now there's a real desire to not repeat the mistakes of 2016, which is why we're seeing this increased effort at transparency. Obviously, it's been criticized left and right by the Republicans, by the Democrats for different reasons. Democrats say that the statements have lumped in Russia with China and Iran unfairly, because Russia is the more acute threat and China and Iran are just being thrown in there to appease the president because he's so sensitive about Russia. And the Republicans say that the Democrats are just trying to manipulate intelligence and that they just want to focus on Russia because that's politically beneficial for them. But regardless, I think what this does generally is just to gird the public for anything, right? And I think that this is definitely a step up from 2016. Could they be doing more? Probably. I mean, they could be telling us more about what they're seeing in terms of the influence efforts, and they could be providing more detail. And the intel community has said that it's going to be issuing updates pretty much up through Election Day on this subject. But I think that it's a step in the right direction. It's better than having no public awareness at all on this issue, short of the media. And the biggest challenge remains having a president who at every turn is undercutting what his own agencies are trying to inform the public.
So I would agree with Natasha that there's a lot more that they could go do. I was in The Perfect Weapon quite critical of the Obama administration for reacting too slowly and underreacting. And I understand why they underreacted. They were fearful that if they called out Putin or reacted to it too strongly and too publicly prior to the election, they didn't know what he could do to the polling systems on the actual election day. And their fear was that Hillary Clinton would win, but that there would be enough material for then candidate Donald Trump to claim that the election was stolen from him and question the legitimacy of a Clinton win. Well, it turned out that wasn't really how things quite sorted out. And so when they went after the Russians, it was well after the election and had a sort of too little, too late element to it. You'll remember that in early January, they threw 35 diplomats who were really spies out of the country and closed 2 big diplomatic facilities. And someone who was in the administration and leaving at the time said to me the day they did it, "We've just come up with the perfect 19th century response to a 21st century problem." Okay. The Trump administration started in the right direction. They had a very good cyber team at the White House the first year and a half until John Bolton came in and basically got rid of them all. And they were exposing Russian and North Korean operations, including NotPetya, which was one of the biggest attacks, and Russian in origin. But my fear is that the intelligence community is still thinking about this data in Cold War terms, and that they have to protect all of their revelations because it will affect sources and methods. And there are ways to strip sources and methods out. But let's remember, this isn't nuclear data. The US government does not have a monopoly on the intelligence. As we discussed before, there are a lot of private companies that are seeing an awful lot of stuff the US government isn't seeing and can report on it quite freely. And the other thing that's happening here is that our reluctance to sort of be more forthcoming about what kind of operations we're doing, I'm convinced, is getting in the way of our deterrent effect. Imagine if the US government had, after the revelation of Olympic Games with Stuxnet, said to the Iranians, "Yeah, we did this. And there's a lot more we could have done that we didn't." Imagine had they done the same thing with the Russians. And so I think we need a radically different way to think about it, in which you would presume that all cyber intelligence is made public as soon as possible, and then have to make the exception for something that is classified rather than the other way around.
Thanks for that. And we are just have time for one more quick question and then any closing thoughts you might have. But I just had to get this question in. This is from Stephen Ramsey. And he asks, for parents, what should we be teaching kids to help them identify disinformation? I guess more broadly, to navigate this brave new world that we now find ourselves in.
I think I'll delegate that to David.
She's only doing that because she knows I have kids who are now, grown and have figured out their disinformation, what their favorite sources of disinformation and information are. Look, this is just a fundamental question of internet literacy out here. That 10 years ago, we knew it was wrong when people said, "I read it on the internet," but didn't think very hard about what the source was and what the nature of that source is and where they got their news. And do they have a real newsroom like the one that Natasha works in or worked in before everybody was working from home and that I've worked in at the Times? Do they do their own collection? How do they vet that data? And you want kids to be thinking about that basically from kindergarten forward. Because if they're not, it's not just Russian disinformation or Chinese disinformation they're not thinking about. They're not thinking about what kind of data they're giving to TikTok or what kind of data they're getting from TikTok. TikTok right now is mostly dance videos, but there is a political, if you put hashtag Biden, you're going to read a lot about Joe Biden, and same thing about Donald Trump. So this is just something we have to orient our education system to from the very beginning.
Well, that's a wonderful place to leave it. Thank you very much to Natasha and David for sharing their time and insights with us today. Thanks to Craig Newmark for his support and vision, and thanks to the whole DFRLab team for their work on making the Foreign Interference Attribution Tracker possible. And you can visit that again at interference2020.org. And finally, thanks very much to our audience for joining us today. Please stay safe. Take care.